Round of applause for our lecturer.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia. Ladies and gentlemen, how are you feeling? How are you feeling tonight? Thank you very much. I like this energy. I wish Nairobi had more of this. All right. I'm going to begin with a little bit of introduction about myself. I don't know. Let's listen. My name is Eric Mwaura. On TikTok, I go by Prof. Mwaura. I have a following of around 50,000. Thank you for that. So I started my TikTok channel there with an aim to promote the public understanding of physics, mathematics, and philosophy. And I thank God so far. So my job, for the last 8 years of my life, I have been working as a graphic designer. We are going to look tonight on the topic of the geometry of the universe versus mankind. And I'm going to be lecturing about the misalignment of human design with nature. So I have been dealing with shapes for the last 8 years of my life, as I have said, as a graphic designer, and I spend my whole time looking at shapes and thinking, what is going on? If you ask even a child in elementary school, although nowadays it's PP1, PP2, I don't understand all that, the first thing that we are taught after the numbers and the letters is shapes. I do remember myself as a kid learning about triangles, a star, an oval, a circle, a square, a rectangle. And shapes are fundamental to our universe. And they are both seen in nature and in human design. Shapes come in different forms. We have a line. So a line is termed as a one-dimensional shape. Then we have two-dimensional shapes, such as a square, a rectangle, a circle, an oval. They go on and on and on and on and on and on. A five-sided figure is called a pentagon. A six-sided figure is called a hexagon. A seven-sided figure is called a what? A heptagon. Thank you very much. Clap for yourself. What about an eight-sided figure? Nine-sided figure? 10-sided figure? Thank you very much. Clap for yourselves. Then we go to the... So, I hope you'll be able to follow together with me on the screens. When we, apart from one-dimensional shapes, apart from two-dimensional shapes, we have three-dimensional shapes. We have the likes of a cube, a sphere, a pyramid, a dodecahedron, and so on and so forth. There are just way too many shapes in this world, and each has a meaning. Let us go to the next slide. Now, we have some common shapes in nature. When you look around you in nature, some shapes are way too prevalent. They appear more times than others. Notably, a sphere comes first and circle. So round shapes, spherical shapes, they just happen to be too prevalent in nature, and we are going to discover why in the next slides. We also have spirals, spiraling shapes that happen in this world, especially in nature, and even hexagons at the same time. And we're going to see great examples of where these shapes do manifest themselves in nature. Now let's look at, for example, a sphere and compare it with a cube. One of the reasons why a sphere is going to appear in nature more than a cube is simply because a sphere just happens to be in geometry. It is a shape that has the minimal surface area for any given volume. Just look at that slide there. I'm comparing the sphere together with the cube. Go to the next slide, please. If you look at a sphere with a volume of 1 and compare it with a cube whose volume is also 1, and then try to compare the surface areas, you will discover that the sphere has a surface area of 4.83 and the surface area of the cube is 6. So for this reason, it just happens that nature is not in the business of wasting material. So it just chooses to use the least surface area to make a shape. Now, let's see other examples. Let's see the examples of shapes in nature that take place as a sphere. All planets, all the suns, all the moons, they are all spherical. And this actually brings me to make a point here that the earth cannot be flat. The earth is round. Simply because we have observed every other planet in the universe to be spherical in shape. Then, when you look at things like water droplets, a bubble, when you look at even the dew in the morning, all these happen to form spherical shapes. Look at all the fruits you can think of, the likes of avocado, an apple, an orange, a berry. Most of these fruits, they also happen to take shape in spheres. Other times, we have ovals. For example, eggs are oval. And even the microorganisms, such as the viruses, the bacteria, they also happen to take shape as spherical and round objects. But now, we should ask this question. Why does nature choose? Why does nature seem to choose or to prefer round shapes? Number one, it has to do with energy distribution. So, it just happens that round shapes are very good in distributing energy around the surface. So a sphere distributes energy evenly across its surface. Something else has to do with strength and durability, and even something else also has to do with fluidity and adaptability. Meaning that if you want something to roll, or wherever rolling is involved, then spheres and circles become the ideal candidate. Let us look a little bit at the spirals. Now, what is a spiral? A spiral is a shape that keeps growing, and it grows consistently. The behavior of a spiral can be explained by the Fibonacci sequence. Now, what is the Fibonacci sequence? It is a list of numbers that was discovered by an Italian mathematician in those years. He just discovered that if you take 0 and the next number, which is 1, and you add them together, 0 plus 1 is 1, and then if you take 1 and you add to 2, you get 3. Now, 2 plus 3 is 5. Then if you keep taking the previous number, adding it to the subsequent number, for example, 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, 8 plus 5 is 13, 13 plus 8 is 21. So that sequence is called the Fibonacci sequence. And it's a very interesting number because it appears in nature quite a lot. If you look at the shapes of flowers that you find in nature and count how many petals you're going to find on those flowers, it will be one of these numbers. Rarely do we have a number that is not in the Fibonacci sequence appearing in nature. And also, it dictates, or it also appears in what we call the golden ratio. This is a ratio that defines beauty, at least mathematically. It was discovered in ancient Greece. And I've also provided formulas for those who are interested in formulas to see how we can calculate it. Now, let us look at other shapes in nature. You can see I have provided images there for why we have spirals. For example, in hurricanes, every time you see winds blowing, they blow in spiraling shapes. Other flowers, when they grow, they seem to be laying layers on top of whatever is growing, forming a spiral. There are just way too many prevalent shapes in nature. Now, another shape is a hexagon. It's a very interesting shape. It's one of the least shapes with corners that happen to appear in nature. A hexagon, a 6-sided figure. But one thing you notice about a hexagon is that it only appears where there's a pattern. It's very unlikely that you will find a hexagon on its own in nature. Mostly when you find a hexagon, it is within a pattern, a tessellated pattern. And they don't start as hexagons. They start as spheres, but because of compressing against each other, they form the shape of a hexagon. And that's how a honeycomb forms. If you take a keen look at a honeycomb, it forms hexagonal shapes. And other examples are the basalt columns and even the snowflake. These are perfect examples of where hexagons appear in nature. And even if I could mention one of the applications we have found of a hexagon, a perfect, is when you look at bolts and nuts. If you look at any bolt or a nut that is fixed, most of them have a hexagonal shape. It is not random. It is because a hexagon is one of the most stable shapes, simply because it is formed by 2 triangles. If you divide a hexagon into 2 diagonally, you find it is 2 triangles. Another majestic example of how shapes appear in nature. Now, let us look at the kind of shapes that appear in human design. So we have seen the shapes of nature. Now let's go to the human world. What kind of shapes are prevalent in the human world? And I don't even have to go deep. Just look around yourself. You have stuff that have been made by humans. What shapes do you think most of them are trying? Look at my phone. It's rectangular. Look at the TV you're watching there. It's rectangular. Look at these tables. They look square to me. And there are just way too many shapes that appear in human nature. But for some good reason, there are way too many prevalent squares and rectangles in human design. And it is not random. It is because of a few reasons. For example, if you want functionality, something that's functional, for example, in packaging, I would be very disappointed if I found a carton, a box, that's not a box, like it's not a box. How would you pack it? It'd be very bad in packing. So for the reasons of packing, squares, or let me call them boxes, cubes, cuboids, they just happen to be the best candidate. Look at a shipping container. It is a cube, not a cube, but a cuboid. And for good reason, because when you're transporting them on the ship, you need to stack them. So they are very good in stacking on top of each other, and that's why we use them a lot. However, we also have rounded shapes in human design, and a good example is the earliest invention of mankind, which is the wheel. Now, anytime you find a circular shape in human design, it is for a good reason. And most of the time, it is when we have motion. So I would also be very disappointed if we found a car with wheels that are not round. So the best shape that has proved to work is simply a circle. There is a guy I follow on YouTube. It's called Adam Savage or something like that. He actually tried this experiment. He built a car with square wheels, and he tried to drive it. And it was one of the most uncomfortable experiences I've ever seen on camera. So circles happen to be very good in drawing. Something else about rounded shapes in human design, when you find them, is because we want to, it is in applications where pressure is a concept of significance. I can give examples of this. I just spoke of containers, shipping containers. But if you have a keen eye and you look at these trucks that transport LPG gas, water trucks, their tanks are always in a cylindrical shape. And there's a very good reason for this again. It is because fluids and gases, they do exert pressure, and you need a shape that is going to have equal distribution of pressure along the surface. And a circle happens to be the best candidate again for this kind of work. So circles in human design are for motion and for pressure or energy distribution. Now, we have triangles. Let's go to the next slide. We have triangles. Another interesting shape. It is a three-sided figure. Now, how do triangles appear in human design, and for what reason? Now, a triangle is the only shape, a triangle is the only polygon that cannot deform without changing the length of one of its sides. And for this reason, it is a very sturdy, a very strong, a robust shape. Look at a bicycle frame. There has been an observation for a very long time, since the Germans invented the bicycle. The shape of the frame of a bicycle has remained consistent for more than 100 years. That's the strongest shape you can have for a bicycle. Like if you make a bicycle to be in the form of a square or a rectangle, expect it not to bear the weight or the mass of the rider. Simply because a triangle is one of the most strongest shapes we have in nature. And for that reason, where we require strength, we run for triangles. Look at a bridge. Look at the trusses. Look at the bridge, the rails of a bridge. Most of them are divided to form triangles. Look at the telecommunication mast. Look at the shapes of those runs that rise up to the top. They simply form triangular shapes because we need strength. And also when you look at houses, the trusses, they also happen to have triangular shapes. So for stability, a triangle fits for human design. Now, let us look at something else. Why are our phones, for example, in this shape? Have you ever asked yourself, why don't we have a circular phone? Like a smartphone which is circular. Why don't we have a TV that takes form in a circle? It is simply because when we want order, when we want logic, when we want control, straight lines happen to be the best solution for that matter. When you look at our cities, for example, civil engineers, they try as much as they can to make the streets very straight so that the blocks can fit within. So anytime you want to organize, to be tidy, and to be seen like you're smart, straight lines they have that aesthetic value within them. I think a phone is best in this shape. I don't think there's another shape in which, unless I'm convinced otherwise, I would still manage to design a phone in this shape. Okay, let's see. Now, I want to speak something else that has to do with shapes. Architecture. Architecture is the designing of houses. Have you ever asked yourself how our houses have developed since the past? How many of you here are old enough? I believe we have tasted the African life. How many of you have ever been in an African hut? At least spend some time in an African hut. Okay, thank you very much. I was brought up in the village and I saw them, but now they are no longer there. But it is something that our ancestors did when they built houses. For some reason, a round shape was their solution for that time. Although it was limited by the technology of that time, we are coming to a sudden realization that there's an interesting knowledge to learn here from rounded houses. If you look at ancient architecture, for example, from the Romans, they did include dome-shaped tops of houses, and that was because there was no steel. Iron was there, but steel was not there. So how do you make a strong dome that doesn't use metal? The only solution you have there is a shape. Sometimes shapes are the only solutions if you, the solution to the problems we face in this world. And just to mention some example, one good example where a shape is such an excellent solution for a problem is you consider the shape of an egg. You see now, an egg is very fragile. And nature designed an egg to be in that shape because an egg is able to distribute energy and the stress evenly across its surface. I bet you this, if you could make an egg in another shape, like a cube or a cuboid, that egg, it would be so weak, it would crack just so easily. But the shape of an egg, even with a very weak eggshell, maintains its structural integrity. So nature has used shapes as a smart way to drive its design. And I too think we should do that. Now look at the houses we have today, the skyscrapers. I have actually included an example of the buildings we find around us in the cities we are living in modernity. Now, we no longer build so many circular houses. Yes, we do. For example, the KICC building is round. And did you hear about the architect who built that building and the inspiration he gave for that? I can see now we are on the same page. But if you were to list, okay, those who know should tell those who don't know, okay? And just go and search quietly what was the shape of the AICC, the right form. Now, if you list for me the number of buildings you know in Nairobi, I bet you that most of them, a good number of them, way more than half, are going to be rectangular and not round. And this again is driven by the needs and the technological advancements of today. So today, we can make square houses, rectangular houses, simply because we have the materials and the technology to do that. But again, at what cost? Let's see the next slides. There is something else in shapes called biomimicry. So what is biomimicry? It is an area where humans turn to nature to get inspiration. One example is this train. It's a Japanese train. It's called the Shinkansen. So it's a bullet train. And the nose, the shape of the nose was borrowed from this bird called the kingfisher. Why did they have to do this? They were solving a problem. Now, trains that came before this one did not have a long nose. And anytime a train goes through a tunnel, remember a tunnel doesn't have a lot of space inside, air would compress. And remember a train is moving very fast. So at the front of the train, air is getting compressed. And by the time the train is exiting from the tunnel, there will be a sonic boom, very loud, disturbing sounds coming from the compressed air from within the tunnel. So they decided one way we can solve this is by changing the shape of the nose of the train. And that's how this is one of the best aerodynamic trains we have today. And Another example is this bird, the falcon bird, against the peregrine falcon and the Northrop. This kind of airplane, it's a military airplane in the US. They simply borrowed from this falcon. It's an example of biomimicry, again for their own reasons. When we talk about shapes in nature, in human design, we just don't look at shapes in isolation. Shapes also are influenced, especially in nature, they are influenced by forces. A good example is gravity. One of the reasons why planets, the sun, the moon, and every body that we see up there is spherical can be answered by gravity. So gravity is this force that pulls the mass of something towards itself. It was first elaborated by Isaac Newton, and gravity also explains why the Earth is not just spherical and it's not just a perfect sphere. It is bulged at the equator, and this again comes from the rotation of the Earth. Now, have you ever considered mountains, the shape of a mountain? Why is a mountain, highest at the peak? That shape of a mountain is controlled by gravity. Have you ever asked yourself why, if you take sand and you pour sand on the ground and you try to pour a lot of it, sand will flow on the sides and remaining with a pointed top. So its gravity is responsible for that shape. So it is not shaped by anything else, but by the forces of nature. So nature is responsible for these kinds of things. Now let's talk about something else, atmospheric pressure. Now, how does atmospheric pressure influence shapes? This only happens when we are talking about hollow objects. Do you remember there was this experiment we used to do? In those years, we are told that if you take a bottle which has water and then you boil it and then you pour cold water, what happens to the bottle? Collapses within itself. And the explanation is atmospheric pressure. I was looking at this today and I found a very brilliant example. When meteorologists are measuring the atmospheric pressure, they take a balloon and they fit an electronic chip inside, and they don't put a lot of gas. They just put very little gas, helium gas, and they let it go. And it flies and flies and flies above, and at around 30 kilometers above, it bursts, simply because there is no atmospheric pressure there, and that now helps them to understand or to measure how is the atmospheric pressure. So there are many shapes, and there are also energies or forces that dictate what shapes are going to look like, at least in this universe. How shapes affect human life. This is one of the most interesting slides in this presentation. Not many people know that the shape of something can affect your experience. Okay? As a human being, the shape of something that you interact with can shape your experience. One of them, example, is comfort. If you want to design a comfortable, something that's comfortable, one of the things you avoid is corners, sharp edges. Avoid sharp edges and corners if what you want to design has to have comfort in it. Now, something else is psychological impact. Anytime we see sharp objects, they have the tendency to invoke the feelings of fear. Sometimes we feel afraid when we just look at sharp objects. Imagine if you had a knife that was not sharp. Imagine if you had a round knife. It wouldn't even feel threatening. So shapes are responsible for how we feel. Now, something else has to do with this environmental harmony. Sometimes we design shapes simply because we want them to look natural or to be in line with nature. One big question we ask ourselves tonight: are we designing spaces that conflict with our innate preferences? So this is a question for designers. And remember, I said I have been a designer for 8 years. So every time I design, I'm asking myself, are we designing spaces that conflict with our innate preferences? If we have already seen what nature is doing out there, including so many rounded shapes within its design, and it is these shapes that we have seen have the capacity to influence how we feel, our emotions, why do we still go to the extent of designing shapes that seem to fight with our innate preferences? Now, look at this example I have provided here. In the 1950s, engineers discovered a fascinating concept of airplanes. And if you have never been on a flight, or you're planning to be on a flight soon, I'm giving you a small assignment. Go and examine the shape of the windows of an aircraft. And you will always find that the windows of an airplane have no corners. They are usually rounded. And that's something I can tell you where it came from. Now, before 1950s, engineers used to make planes with windows with corners. And there were many accidents that claimed people's lives, and the companies which owned those aircrafts, they started saying it's the pilot's error, it has something to do with engineering of the planes, until they came to examine the shape of the windows. So the shape of the windows contribute to the structural integrity of the entire aircraft. So they discovered that if you round the corners, the windows, you are going to spread evenly the energy or the forces that stretch the material that makes the aircraft. So by using rounded shapes, you avoid corners and you avoid points of stress. Have in mind that everywhere there's a corner in design, that is a point of stress concentration. One example I can give that application is, if your phone falls down, it's more likely to break the screen if it hits the floor on one of the four corners, because stress is concentrated around the corners of the tubes. But if a phone falls on its face or on its back, there's a higher probability the screen will break. But if it falls, if it lands on one of the corners, there's a lot of stress and the screen will just break on itself. So in today's world, we don't design airplane with corners. A brilliant example of how a shape has been used to save lives, for safety, and not just for safety, and it also happens to align with the natural principles of design. Now, I say that in graphic design, when I'm choosing the shapes, it is usually very intentional. Look at these two fonts. I hope you can see this on your screens. The message on this paper remains the same. I will always love you. But compare the kind of fonts that have been used. One font includes shapes with rounded curves, but the other one has very sharp and pointy ends of the letters. And it looks like it was taken from a horror film. If someone was to send you this, I will always find you. It feels like it's screaming. It's like it's menacing. It's like it's threatening your life. So this is another brilliant example of how rounded shapes are good for safety and comfort, and sharp shapes invoke feelings of fear or even sometimes anger. And this is why if you want to start a psychologist who talk to people who are under stress, they are very intentional with the buildings they choose. Most of the time, in the spaces they have, they include a lot of rounded shapes for safety, comfort, and all that. I'm almost now towards the end of my presentation. This is an airport in Singapore. The government of Singapore decided to do this experiment. They decided, how about we design an airport that is going to feel safe and comfortable to travel. If you have ever been to an airport, it's actually one of the busiest places on earth. In fact, the person who said as busy as a bee, I think he had not been to an airport. People are moving up and down, and if you are new to the experience, it can be very disturbing. So the Singaporean government wanted to create an airport which aligns with nature. And guess what they went for? An L-shaped airport. And they planted a lot of trees inside. And it has been termed as one of the best designs for a public space. One that doesn't feel too menacing or does not invoke human feelings. Now, in this other slide here, I'm asking a question. Could this possibly be the future of design? Now that we are seeing a lot of rounded shapes being used in nature, is the future planning to use this? Because if you look at the houses engineers are planning to build on Mars, most of them are taking rounded, dome-like shapes. Could this be possibly the future of design? Are we going back to the rounded African hut? Are we realizing maybe our ancestors were right from the word go? When you look on this next slide, look at that kind of a furniture. It is a sofa. I would wish to sit here the whole day. A lot of curves, a lot of rounded shapes to make it feel comfortable. Look at the table, it uses no corners. And for this reason, it already feels comfortable even from the picture. Look at it. I feel like it would be more comfortable to sleep in this kind of a shape, where I don't have to know that my head faces this direction or my feet faces this kind of direction. Look at the kind of spaces you design for your houses to make them feel more relaxing. Rounded shapes just have the solution for that. In conclusion, now I have come to the end of my lecture. In conclusion, 4 things that we have learned in today's lecture. Number 1, shapes in nature are solutions to various physical, chemical, and biological challenges. We have seen that nature uses shapes to solve some of the challenges it faces. Number 2, human design often prioritizes geometric shapes and straight lines simply because of practicality, functionality, and sometimes aesthetic. So when you find them in human design, it's for those reasons. Number 3, something else we have learned in today's lecture. Can we realign our design with nature's philosophy? For those of you who design, and for those of you who buy stuff that has been designed by designers like me, can we please try to look at those shapes that align with nature and our innate human experiences? Because who knows, they might have an extended effect to the experience of our lives. And lastly, the future of design may embrace organic forms so that we have a more balanced world. So as we have seen, rounded shapes balance the forces around them, they create a balance that cannot be attained by any other kind of shape. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope you have understood it.